The Roman Republic was born from rejection. In 509 BCE, the kings were expelled, and with them went the fear of singular rule, inherited power, and unchecked authority. What replaced monarchy was not democracy in any modern sense, but a carefully balanced system designed to ensure that no one man would ever again stand above the state. Power was divided, limited in time, and shared among offices that were meant to restrain one another. On paper, the Republic was a triumph of collective governance. Yet from its earliest days, the Republic carried a contradiction at its core. It claimed to rule in the name of the people, but it was constructed by and for a narrow elite. The overthrow of the kings did not come from a mass uprising of Roman society. It was led by aristocratic families who had long resented royal authority. The Republic was less a social revolution than a reconfiguration of power at the top. Kings were replaced by consuls, but those consuls came from the same families who had dominated Rome for generations. The language of liberty changed. The structure of inequality did not. To understand the First Secession of the Plebs, one must begin here, with a republic that promised freedom while quietly preserving hierarchy. The Romans' hatred of kingship shaped everything that followed. The memory of the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was preserved as a moral warning. Arrogance, cruelty, and tyranny embodied in a single figure. Whether this memory was exaggerated or selectively remembered mattered less than its effect. Romans came to believe that concentrated power was inherently dangerous. The solution was institutional fragmentation. Executive authority was split between two consuls, elected annually. Religious authority was distributed among priesthoods. The Senate, composed of former magistrates, provided continuity and experience. No office was permanent, no man indispensable. But this architecture was designed to restrain individuals, not classes. While power was divided horizontally among offices, it remained vertically concentrated within a small segment of society. Political equality was never the goal. Stability was. In theory, Roman citizens participated in assemblies that elected magistrates and approved laws. In practice, these assemblies were weighted in favor of wealth and status. Voting was not equal. It was organized by property classes and centuries that ensured elite dominance even when they were numerically fewer. Office holding was restricted by custom, lineage, and access. The early republic did not explicitly ban plebeians from power. It did not need to. Tradition, religious authority, and social pressure were sufficient barriers. Public life belonged to those who had the education, wealth, and ancestral prestige to navigate it. The Republic spoke the language of collective rule, but it listened most closely to familiar voices. For the aristocracy, this was not hypocrisy. It was order. Rome, they believed, survived because it was guided by those best suited to lead, men shaped by tradition, ritual, and inherited responsibility. The Republic did not promise equality, it promised continuity. The early Republic was almost immediately tested by war. Surrounded by rival Latin cities, Etruscan powers, and hostile neighbors, Rome fought constantly for survival. These wars demanded soldiers, not just aristocratic commanders, but thousands of citizen infantry. This was where the Republic's contradiction became visible. The same men who defended Rome with their bodies returned home to find themselves powerless in its politics. They were citizens when war was declared, but subjects when peace returned. Military service created an expectation of reciprocity, sacrifice in exchange for protection, but the Republic offered honor without security. Victory did not lift all boats, it deepened divisions. Land seized in war often ended up controlled by elites. Wealth generated by expansion circulated within aristocratic networks. Meanwhile, small farmers who had left their fields to fight returned to debt, neglect, and vulnerability. The Republic depended on the plebs to survive, but it was not designed to serve them. To the Roman elite, freedom meant freedom from kings. To the plebs, freedom increasingly meant freedom from exploitation. This difference in definition mattered. The aristocracy celebrated the republic as a triumph because it preserved their autonomy and status. They could compete with one another without fearing royal domination. Political struggle was internal, regulated, and familiar. For ordinary citizens, the republic felt less like liberation and more like replacement. One master had been removed, only to be replaced by many less visible, but no less powerful. The language of liberty masked the reality of dependence. The early republic prioritized endurance above all else. Its institutions were flexible enough to survive crisis, but rigid enough to resist transformation. Conflict was not eliminated, it was contained. So long as the system did not collapse, inequality could be tolerated. This was not cruelty, it was calculation. Rome's leaders believed that order was fragile, and that pushing reform too far risked chaos. Better to preserve an imperfect system than to gamble on an untested one. Better to allow grievances to simmer than to confront them head-on. But grievances do not remain abstract forever. For years after the fall of the monarchy, social tension accumulated quietly. Plebeians petitioned, debtors pleaded, veterans complained. There was no formal channel for these voices to shape policy, only informal appeals to those in power. The Republic heard them and chose patience. The assumption was that endurance would outlast resentment, that tradition would command loyalty, that citizens would continue to serve even without protection, because Rome was their home. This assumption would prove fragile. The Republic had been designed to prevent tyranny. It had not been designed to absorb inequality indefinitely. By 494 BCE, the contradiction at its heart, liberty without inclusion, could no longer be ignored. The question was no longer whether the Republic would change, but how, and whether it would do so willingly. To understand why the first secession of the plebs became inevitable, one must understand the divide that defined early Roman society. The conflict between patricians and plebeians was not simply a matter of wealth versus poverty, nor nobles versus commoners in the medieval sense. It was deeper, older, and more structural, a division embedded in law, religion, and identity itself. This divide did not emerge because Rome grew unequal. It existed because Rome was built unequal. The patricians were not merely the rich. They were the inheritors of Rome's earliest political identity. Their status was defined by ancestry, families who claimed descent from the original senators appointed under the kings. Whether this claim was historically accurate mattered less than the authority it conferred. Patrician identity carried with it exclusive access to religious knowledge, legal customs, and political legitimacy. They controlled priesthoods, interpreted the will of the gods, and preserved ancestral traditions, mos maiorum, that governed public life. In a society where religion and law were inseparable, this control was decisive. To be patrician was not simply to have power, it was to embody Rome's order. This made patrician authority appear natural, even sacred. Their dominance was justified not by force alone, but by tradition, ritual, and memory. The plebeians, by contrast, were defined not by what they were, but by what they were excluded from. They were Roman citizens, but not members of Rome's ruling clans. They included farmers, craftsmen, traders, laborers, and soldiers. Some were poor, others were moderately prosperous. A few were even wealthy, but none belonged to the closed circle of families who monopolized authority. This distinction is crucial. The conflict was not a simple uprising of the destitute. Many plebeians owned land, served honorably in war, and paid taxes. What united them was not uniform hardship, but shared vulnerability. They lacked protection. They had no guaranteed access to justice, no voice in policy, no office holder obligated to defend them. Their citizenship came with duties, military service, taxation, obedience, but few enforceable rights. Roman citizenship in the early republic was not a shield. It was a bond of obligation. Plebeians fought in Rome's armies, often forming the backbone of the infantry. They defended the city, expanded its territory, and endured the hardships of near-constant warfare. Yet military service did not translate into political leverage. Assemblies existed, but their structure favored the wealthy. Voting units were organized in ways that allowed elite minorities to outvote popular majorities. Even when plebeians technically participated, outcomes were largely predetermined. This created a quiet but corrosive contradiction. The Republic relied on plebeians to survive, yet denied them a meaningful role in its direction. Over time, this contradiction eroded loyalty. The legal system reinforced this imbalance. Laws were unwritten, preserved through precedent and interpretation by patrician magistrates. This made justice flexible, but only for those who controlled its meaning. For plebeians, the law was opaque and unpredictable. A patrician could appeal to tradition, ritual, or custom. A plebeian had little recourse beyond pleading. Even when wronged, they depended on elite goodwill. This was not merely unfair, it was destabilizing. When law becomes inaccessible, it ceases to command respect. Religion deepened the divide. Patricians controlled augury, priesthoods, and sacred calendars. Since public action required divine approval, this gave elites the power to delay assemblies, invalidate decisions, or justify authority through religious signs. Political exclusion was thus reinforced by cosmic order. Plebeians were not just excluded from office, they were excluded from the mechanisms that legitimized office. Their marginalization appeared sanctioned by the gods themselves. Importantly, the patrician-plebeian divide was not rigidly defined at first. Some families may have moved between categories over generations, but by the early republic, the boundary had hardened. Custom became destiny. What made this division particularly volatile was that it contradicted Rome's own narrative. Rome celebrated itself as a community of citizens united by shared values and collective effort. Yet its social structure told a different story, one of inherited privilege and restricted belonging. The plebeians were not outsiders, they were Rome. And yet they were treated as permanent dependents. Despite this inequality, plebeians did not initially seek to overthrow the system. There was no ideology of equality, no articulated vision of popular sovereignty. What they sought was protection, fairness, and recognition within the existing order. But they lacked the language and institutions to express these demands. There were no representatives to speak on their behalf, no courts to appeal to, no offices designed to hear them. Discontent accumulated in silence, passed through households, workshops, and army camps. This made it dangerous. Grievances that cannot be voiced do not disappear, they gather weight. From a distance, Rome appeared unified. External threats encouraged solidarity. Rituals emphasized collective identity. The Republic presented itself as a harmonious body, each part fulfilling its role. But beneath this surface, the social divide widened. Patricians saw themselves as guardians of tradition. Plebeians increasingly saw themselves as expendable. The same system was interpreted in radically different ways depending on where one stood. This divergence of experience would soon become impossible to reconcile through patience alone. The plebeians' greatest weakness was also their latent strength. Individually, they were powerless. Collectively, they were indispensable. They staffed the fields, filled the ranks, sustained the economy. Without them, the Republic could not function. This reality was long ignored even by the plebeians themselves. But by the early 5th century BCE, a realization began to form. If citizenship brought obligations without protection, then withdrawal, not rebellion, might be the only remaining option. The divide between patricians and plebeians had created a republic that could command obedience, but not loyalty. The question was no longer whether this divide would produce conflict. It was when. In the early decades of the Roman Republic, war was not an occasional crisis. It was a condition of existence. Rome did not yet dominate Italy. It struggled simply to survive within it. Surrounded by rival Latin cities, hostile hill tribes, and powerful neighbors, the Republic lived in a near-constant state of mobilization. Every planting season risked interruption. Every generation expected to fight. And it was the plebeians who carried this burden. The fall of the monarchy did not bring peace. If anything, it made Rome more vulnerable. Former allies tested the new regime. Enemies sensed weakness. Without a king to command unquestioned loyalty, the Republic relied on shared obligation to defend itself. Wars were seasonal but relentless. Campaigns were fought close to home, but they were no less destructive for it. Fields were abandoned, harvests delayed, families disrupted. For a society built on small-scale agriculture, this had profound consequences. Military service was not a profession. It was a duty, and a costly one. Rome's armies were composed primarily of citizen soldiers, drawn from the property-owning classes. In theory, this reflected civic equality. Those with a stake in the land defended it. In reality, it meant that plebeian farmers bore the brunt of military service. Patricians often served as officers and commanders, but their estates were larger, their households more secure, and their political influence greater. When they went to war, others managed their affairs. When plebeians went to war, their livelihoods waited, unprotected. A season away could mean ruin. The Roman economy depended on continuous labor. Fields required constant attention. Livestock needed care. Workshops could not run themselves. When plebeian men were called to arms, there was no compensation, no guarantee of protection for their property, no forgiveness of obligations. Debt did not pause for war. Upon returning from campaign, many soldiers found their fields neglected, their tools worn, their families struggling. Some returned to find they had borrowed money to survive in their absence, loans that now demanded repayment with interest. Victory abroad often meant vulnerability at home. Roman culture celebrated military virtue. Courage, endurance, and sacrifice were praised as the highest expressions of citizenship. Soldiers were promised honor, but honor did not feed families or cancel debts. For plebeians, this created a bitter contradiction. They fulfilled the Republic's highest expectation, yet received little in return beyond praise. There was no pension, no land guarantee, no institutional support for veterans. Service was framed as a moral duty, not a transaction. This framing benefited the Republic, but it strained those who upheld it. Over time, war widened the gap between rich and poor. Aristocrats were better positioned to absorb the costs of absence. They had surplus labor, diversified wealth, and access to credit on favorable terms. Plebeians did not. Repeated campaigns eroded their economic stability, pushing many toward dependency. Land seized in war was often claimed by elites or managed by the state in ways that favored those with influence. Smallholders rarely benefited directly from expansion. The spoils of victory did not circulate evenly. Rome grew stronger. Its people did not grow equally secure. Beyond economics, war imposed a psychological burden. Plebeian soldiers were asked to risk their lives for a system that excluded them. They fought alongside patricians, yet returned to a society where those same men judged them, ruled them, and interpreted the law against them. This created a quiet resentment, not against Rome itself, but against how Rome was organized. Loyalty endured, but it became conditional. On campaign, distinctions blurred. In battle, discipline and cooperation mattered more than ancestry. Soldiers depended on one another regardless of class. This experience mattered. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in war found it increasingly difficult to accept rigid inequality in peace. The army became a space where plebeians recognized their collective importance. They were not merely subjects, they were Rome's defenders. This realization would later shape political action. Despite their service, plebeians had no institutional means to convert sacrifice into influence. Military valor did not translate into political protection. There was no office to represent veterans, no mechanism to address their grievances. Appeals were personal, not structural. A soldier might beg a magistrate for mercy, but mercy was discretionary. Justice was not guaranteed. This uncertainty was corrosive. As wars continued, the imbalance deepened. The Republic demanded more from its citizens while offering little reform. The assumption remained that duty would override discontent. But duty has limits. By the early 5th century BCE, the cumulative weight of war, debt, and exclusion had pushed many plebeians to the edge. Their loyalty to Rome remained, but their tolerance for the system did not. The Republic had asked for sacrifice without providing security. Soon, the men who had defended Rome would ask a question of their own. What did their citizenship truly mean? If war exposed the Republic's dependence on the plebeians, debt revealed how little protection that dependence offered. For many ordinary Romans, military service did not end with the return home. It followed them into their fields, their homes, and ultimately their bodies, through a system that bound economic failure to personal freedom. This system was known as nexum. It was not an aberration. It was legal. It was accepted. And it lay at the heart of the crisis that led to the First Secession of the Plebs. Nexum was a form of debt contract unique to early Rome. A citizen who could not repay a loan pledged his own person as security. Until the debt was repaid, he was bound to his creditor, not as a slave, but as something dangerously close to one. Legally, the debtor remained a citizen. Socially, he was powerless. This distinction mattered only on paper. In practice, debtors could be imprisoned, forced to labor, beaten, and humiliated. Their bodies stood in for money they did not have. Their citizenship offered no immediate protection. Nexum did not arise from cruelty alone. It emerged from a society without bankruptcy, without state welfare, and without mechanisms to absorb economic shock. Credit filled the gap, and credit, controlled by the wealthy, became a tool of domination. For many plebeians, debt began with war. A man conscripted for months could not tend his land. Crops failed, tools broke, families borrowed to survive. Interest accumulated quietly, relentlessly. By the time the soldier returned, repayment was often impossible. Others fell into debt through illness, poor harvests, or legal penalties. In every case, the system favored those who already had surplus. Credit flowed downward, power flowed upward. What made this system especially harsh was its permanence. There was no reset, no forgiveness. A single misfortune could spiral into lifelong bondage. Debt did more than impoverish, it disciplined. A plebeian in debt was cautious. He avoided confrontation. He accepted unfavorable terms. He deferred to authority. His survival depended on the goodwill of his creditor, who was often a patrician magistrate or senator. This created a quiet hierarchy within citizenship itself. Free men became dependent without losing their legal status, a paradox that blurred the line between liberty and servitude. The Republic did not enslave its citizens outright. It allowed them to enslave themselves through necessity. Roman culture valued personal responsibility. Debt was framed as a moral failure, not a structural one. Those who fell into nexum were portrayed as careless or weak, even when their debt resulted from service to the state. This narrative absolved the system. but it did not convince those trapped within it. Stories circulated of veterans in chains, of men scarred by both war and punishment, of citizens reduced to laboring for those they had once fought beside. These stories mattered not because they were exceptional, but because they were recognizable. They revealed a republic willing to sacrifice bodies twice, once in war and again in peace. Debt bondage was often hidden behind walls, but occasionally it became visible. A debtor might appear in the forum bearing marks of punishment, his body a living indictment of the system. Such moments shocked the public conscience, not because Romans rejected hierarchy, but because they recognized excess. There was a line between authority and abuse, and Nexum crossed it repeatedly. These episodes did not yet produce reform, but they planted anger where patience once stood. Why did the Republic not act sooner? Because debt was profitable, because it reinforced hierarchy, because those empowered to reform it benefited from its existence, and because dismantling Nexum would have required acknowledging that the system itself, not individual failure, was unjust. This was a step the elite were unwilling to take. Instead, they offered temporary relief, selective mercy, and symbolic gestures, enough to calm unrest, never enough to change the structure. What made Nexum politically explosive was not its cruelty alone, but its visibility. War was distant, law was abstract, debt was intimate. It entered the home, fractured families, and erased dignity. It turned loyalty into resentment. Plebeians might endure exclusion. They might accept inequality, but bondage struck at the core of Roman identity, the idea that a citizen could not be owned. When citizenship itself could be suspended by debt, the Republic's moral foundation cracked. By the early 5th century BCE, debt had become widespread enough to unite plebeians across occupations and wealth levels. Even those not yet bound recognized how close they stood to the edge. This shared vulnerability mattered. It transformed isolated suffering into collective awareness. The Republic had long assumed that economic pressure would enforce compliance. Instead, it created solidarity. And solidarity, once recognized, became power. The First Secession of the Plebs was not sparked by ideology. It was sparked by experience, by the realization that participation in the Republic brought obligation without protection, sacrifice without security. Debt made that realization unavoidable. When plebeians eventually chose to withdraw from the city, they were not rejecting Rome. They were rejecting a system that treated their bodies as collateral. The Republic had tolerated Nexum because it worked. In 494 BCE, it would learn that it worked too well. In early Republican Rome, the law was everywhere and nowhere. It governed contracts, punishments, debts, and obligations. It shaped daily life and determined who could be protected and who could be broken. Yet for most citizens, especially the plebeians, the law was not something they could see, read, or reliably invoke. It existed as memory, custom, and interpretation, controlled by those already in power. This absence of safeguards turned inequality into inevitability. Rome in the early 5th century BCE had no written legal code. There were traditions, precedents, and ritual formulas, but no public, fixed body of law accessible to all citizens. Legal knowledge was preserved orally, passed down within elite families and religious colleges. This made the law flexible and dangerous. Flexibility allowed magistrates to adapt decisions to circumstance, but it also meant that outcomes depended on who was judging, not what was written. For plebeians, this unpredictability was a constant source of vulnerability. They did not know what the law promised them, only what it demanded. Legal expertise in Rome was inseparable from religion. Patricians dominated priesthoods that controlled calendars, auspices, and ritual language necessary for legal proceedings. Since public action required divine approval, religious authority doubled as legal authority. This fusion of sacred and civic power created a closed system. A plebeian might stand before a magistrate without knowing which words could protect him, which days were legally valid, or which customs would be invoked. His opponent, often wealthier, often patrician, did. Justice became asymmetrical not because laws differed, but because access to them did. Roman law emphasized custom, mos maiorum, rather than abstract rights. What had always been done carried weight. What ancestors approved commanded obedience. This worked well for those whose ancestors had ruled. For plebeians, custom often meant exclusion. They were bound by traditions they had not shaped and could not contest. Appeals to fairness mattered less than appeals to precedent. The law did not ask what was just, it asked what was customary. Magistrates wielded enormous discretionary authority. They interpreted law, imposed penalties, and enforced judgments. There were few checks on this power, especially when both magistrate and creditor belonged to the same social class. A plebeian debtor facing a patrician creditor often encountered a magistrate who shared the creditor's values, networks, and assumptions. Outcomes were rarely neutral. This was not necessarily corruption, it was solidarity. The system functioned smoothly because those within it shared interests. The unpredictability of the law fostered fear. Plebeians learned to avoid confrontation, to settle privately, to accept unfavorable terms rather than risk public judgment. Legal uncertainty became a tool of control. This fear reinforced hierarchy more effectively than force. A citizen who cannot predict the law cannot rely on it. He adapts by submission. Roman elites defended this system as natural. The law, they argued, reflected society's structure. Order required hierarchy. Stability required discretion. Writing laws down would invite manipulation, rigidity, and disorder. This argument prioritized control over transparency. Yet it ignored a fundamental truth. Laws that cannot be known cannot command trust. When plebeians suffered injustice, there was no institution designed to hear them. Assemblies could not adjudicate individual cases. Magistrates answered to peers, not the populace. The Senate debated policy, not grievances. This left suffering unaddressed. Debt, abuse, and exploitation were experienced privately, without collective acknowledgement. There was no official recognition that the system itself might be at fault. Silence replaced accountability. Plebeian discontent was not initially revolutionary. They did not demand equal office holding or radical restructuring. What they sought was predictability, a law that could be known, invoked, and enforced without discretion. They wanted protection, not power. But even this modest demand threatened elite control. Transparency would limit interpretation. Fixed rules would reduce flexibility. Equality before the law would undermine hierarchy. Thus, reform was resisted. Ironically, legal uncertainty helped unify plebeians. Shared vulnerability created shared identity. Stories of injustice circulated, not as isolated failures but as patterns. The law ceased to appear as a neutral arbiter and became a symbol of exclusion. This realization mattered. It transformed private resentment into public awareness. By the early 5th century BCE, Rome's legal structure could no longer absorb the pressures placed upon it. War, debt, and exclusion had converged. The law, instead of resolving conflict, amplified it. The Republic had built institutions to prevent tyranny, but not to prevent injustice. As long as plebeians lacked safeguards, the system relied on their endurance. That endurance was reaching its limit. The question now was not whether the law would change. It was whether the Republic could survive unchanged. In early Republican Rome, political power was not seized by force. It was inherited, cultivated, and quietly protected by tradition. The Republic presented itself as a system of shared governance, but its offices formed a closed circuit, circulating authority among a small number of families who understood power as both a right and a responsibility. For the plebeians, this circuit had no entry point. The Republic's political structure was designed to prevent domination by any single individual. Consuls ruled jointly. Offices were limited in duration. Authority was distributed across magistracies and councils. Yet this architecture addressed one fear only: tyranny from above. It did nothing to prevent domination from within. All major offices, consuls, praetors, quaestors, and religious officials, were drawn from the same social circle. Election existed, but access did not. Custom, ancestry, and informal networks ensured continuity. The Republic rotated power among elites, not citizens. Roman politics relied heavily on precedent. What had always been done defined what could be done. Since early magistrates were patricians, patrician office holding became the norm. This norm hardened into expectation. A plebeian aspiring to office faced not a legal prohibition, but a wall of tradition. He lacked the family name, the patronage, the religious legitimacy, and the social capital required to compete. Exclusion required no written rule. The Senate held no formal legislative authority, yet it dominated policy. Composed of former magistrates, it embodied experience, memory, and continuity. Senators advised, coordinated, and constrained magistrates. This influence was subtle but decisive. The Senate was not representative. It was aristocratic by design. Its deliberations reflected elite priorities, and its recommendations carried moral weight. For plebeians, the Senate was distant and inaccessible. Religious authority reinforced political closure. Patricians controlled priesthoods that interpreted divine will. Since public actions required religious approval, this gave elites the power to delay assemblies, invalidate decisions, or justify authority through omens. Politics and piety were inseparable. Plebeians were excluded not just from office, but from the mechanisms that made office legitimate. Popular assemblies existed, but their influence was limited. Voting structures favored wealthier citizens. Decisions were often constrained by senatorial guidance or religious intervention. Participation did not equal control. Plebeians could attend, but they could not shape outcomes reliably. The Republic maintained the appearance of consent. Elections were held, assemblies convened, laws were approved. But consent without choice is illusion. The system allowed participation while preserving dominance. It invited obedience while restricting influence. Over time, plebeians recognized that appeals within the system were ineffective. There was no office designed to hear them, no magistrate obligated to defend them. Political exclusion turned grievances inward. Resentment grew not because plebeians wanted to rule, but because they wanted to be protected. Elite resistance to reform was rooted in fear. Opening offices risked destabilizing the Republic. Shared power might dilute authority. Tradition might weaken. Better to preserve order than invite uncertainty. This calculation favored continuity, until continuity threatened collapse. By the early 5th century BCE, political power in Rome had become self-reinforcing. Office holders mentored successors. Families cultivated influence across generations. Networks hardened. Plebeians were essential to Rome's survival, but irrelevant to its governance. This imbalance was unsustainable. The Republic could command obedience, but it could not guarantee loyalty. As economic hardship deepened and legal insecurity persisted, political exclusion became intolerable. The plebeians had exhausted every internal avenue. What remained was refusal. By the early 5th century BCE, the Roman Republic was no longer merely unequal. It was unresponsive. The The systems designed to govern the city had become incapable of hearing a growing portion of its population. Grievances accumulated not because they were unprecedented, but because there was nowhere for them to go. Rome had conflict. What it lacked was a voice for those trapped within it. Plebeians did not lack opinions, demands, or shared experiences. They lacked representation. There was no magistrate whose duty was to listen to them, no office whose legitimacy depended on their protection. In theory, citizens could appeal to consuls. In practice, consuls were patricians bound by elite expectations. Their authority rested on maintaining order, not questioning the structure that produced unrest. The plebeians were present in the Republic, but unheard. From time to time, grievances surfaced publicly. Debtors protested. Veterans pleaded for relief. Stories of abuse circulated through the forum. These moments were not revolutionary. They were appeals to fairness within the system. But appeals without leverage rarely succeed. Without institutional backing, complaints depended on elite sympathy. Sympathy was inconsistent. Relief was temporary. Structural reform was avoided. Each failed petition deepened the sense that patience was being mistaken for weakness. The Republic did not ignore plebeian suffering because it was unaware of it. It ignored it because acknowledgement would require action, and action would threaten elite control. Silence became policy. By refusing to formally recognize plebeian grievances, the state preserved the illusion of stability. Problems were treated as individual failures rather than systemic flaws. This approach delayed crisis, but it also ensured that when crisis came, it would be collective. Powerlessness reshapes perception. Plebeians began to see the Republic not as a shared project, but as an apparatus imposed upon them. Loyalty endured, but it thinned. Men who had served Rome faithfully returned to find their suffering dismissed as personal misfortune. This dismissal hurt more than hardship itself. It signaled that sacrifice was expected, but not valued. Elite anxiety grew quietly. The ruling class sensed unrest, but misread its nature. They feared disorder, riots, or violence, threats that could be contained through force. What they failed to anticipate was refusal. The Republic prepared for rebellion. It was not prepared for withdrawal. Plebeians could not vote their way out of injustice. They could not litigate their way to protection. They could not legislate reform. Every legal avenue ended within the same closed circle. This created a dangerous realization. Obedience was optional. The Republic relied on participation, military, economic, civic, that it could not easily compel without destroying itself. Shared suffering slowly produced shared identity. Plebeians began to see their experiences not as isolated misfortunes, but as symptoms of a common condition. This awareness did not arise from ideology, but from recognition. Workshops, farms, and army camps became spaces of quiet political education. Stories were exchanged, patterns recognized. Resentment organized itself without formal leadership. Elite attempts at compromise were superficial. Temporary debt relief, promises of future consideration, appeals to tradition and loyalty. These measures bought time but not trust. The core problem remained untouched. Plebeians had no voice. By 494 BCE, Rome stood at a crossroads. It could reform its institutions to absorb plebeian participation, or it could continue to demand obedience without protection. The first option required humility. The second required faith. The Republic chose faith. It assumed that the plebeians would endure, as they always had. They did not. Instead of shouting louder, they chose silence. Instead of rebellion, they chose absence. And in doing so, they discovered a power the Republic had never accounted for. The First Secession of the Plebs was not a riot. It was not an insurrection. It was not an attempt to overthrow the Roman state. It was something far more unsettling to those in power, a collective refusal to participate. In 494 BCE, the plebeians did not seize the city, they abandoned it. For generations, political conflict in Rome had followed familiar patterns: petitions, appeals, symbolic protests, and occasional unrest. These actions operated within the system and depended on elite response. Secession broke that pattern entirely. Instead of demanding reform through existing channels, the plebeians removed themselves from the channels altogether. They withdrew their labor, their military service, and their presence. The Republic was not confronted with violence, it was confronted with emptiness. Rebellion would have required leaders, weapons, and ideological clarity. Secession required only unity. Plebeians understood something crucial: Rome's power depended on their participation. Without soldiers, there could be no defense. Without labor, no economy. Without citizens, no legitimacy. By leaving, they exposed the state's dependence on those it excluded. This was not an act of despair, it was an act of calculation. One of the most striking features of the secession is the absence of a known leader. No demagogue, no general, no revolutionary figure stands at its center. This anonymity was its strength. Without leaders to arrest or co-opt, the movement could not be dismantled easily. It emerged organically, sustained by shared experience rather than hierarchy. Unity replaced command. Ancient sources differ on the location of the secession. Some place it on the Sacred Mount, others on the Aventine Hill. The exact site matters less than the symbolism. The plebeians did not flee Rome entirely. They remained close enough to be seen and missed. This proximity was deliberate. It transformed absence into pressure. The impact was immediate. Rome could not function without its citizens. Markets stalled, workshops closed, military readiness collapsed. More dangerously, the Republic's legitimacy wavered. A state that claimed to rule in the name of the people suddenly lacked them. Silence replaced authority. The ruling class was unprepared. There was no precedent for this form of resistance. Force was an option, but a risky one. To coerce the plebeians back would require an army drawn from the very people who had left. Violence would fracture the Republic beyond repair. Negotiation became unavoidable. Beyond practical concerns, the secession delivered a moral blow. The plebeians had not attacked Rome, they had denied it. This reframed the conflict. The issue was no longer order versus chaos, it was justice versus exclusion. The Republic could no longer pretend that grievances were isolated. For the first time, plebeians recognized their collective strength, not as a mob but as a foundation. Their absence proved what their presence had concealed. Rome was not merely ruled by elites. It was sustained by the many. The secession marked a shift in Roman political imagination. Conflict no longer meant overthrow, it meant negotiation. The Republic had been built to prevent kings. It had not been built to confront collective refusal. In 494 BCE, the plebeians forced the state to confront a question it had avoided since its founding. Could Rome exist without them? The answer came quickly. The departure of the plebeians did not destroy Rome in flames or bloodshed. It did something far more destabilizing. It exposed how fragile the Republic truly was when stripped of participation. The city still stood. The institutions still existed. The magistrates still held office. But the Republic could no longer function. Rome's ruling elite had long imagined the state as something that could endure hardship through discipline and authority alone. The secession shattered this illusion. Authority without people proved hollow. The Senate could convene, but it could not act. Consuls could issue orders, but there was no one to carry them out. Assemblies could be summoned, but their participants were gone. The machinery of the Republic continued to turn, but it produced nothing. The most immediate danger was military. Rome lived in a hostile environment, surrounded by rivals who closely watched signs of weakness. The absence of the plebeians meant empty ranks, unmanned defenses, and delayed responses. An army cannot be conjured from decree. The very men who normally defended the Republic had withdrawn their service. This was not mutiny, it was abstention, and it left Rome dangerously exposed. Elite leaders understood this risk acutely. A single coordinated attack during the secession could have ended the Republic entirely. That it did not was due more to fortune than planning. Markets depend on trust, labor, and presence. With the plebeians gone, workshops closed and trade slowed. Food distribution faltered. Supplies piled up unused or went missing. The city's economy was not diversified enough to compensate. There were no vast reserves, no professional classes insulated from disruption. Rome's growth had outpaced its resilience. The absence of the plebeians also altered daily life in unsettling ways. Streets grew quieter, homes stood empty, familiar rhythms vanished. For the elite, this silence was unnerving. Power depends not only on obedience but on recognition. Without those who acknowledged it, authority felt unreal. The Republic had been denied its audience. Perhaps the most dangerous consequence was symbolic. The Republic claimed to rule on behalf of its citizens. With the majority of those citizens gone, that claim rang hollow. Was a republic without its people still a republic? This question haunted the Senate. Rome's institutions were intact, but their moral foundation was cracked. Force was discussed, it had to be, but force required soldiers, and soldiers were precisely what Rome lacked. Even if mercenaries or loyalists could be assembled, violence would deepen the crisis. Killing or punishing the plebeians would destroy the very citizen body the Republic depended upon. Repression was not strength, it was suicide. What made the secession effective was its restraint. There were no threats, no ultimatums, no lists of demands. The plebeians simply remained absent. This placed the burden of action entirely on the elite. Silence demanded response. The ruling class was not unified. Some argued for compromise, others feared precedent. To concede now might encourage future withdrawals. But delay carried its own risk. Each day without resolution weakened Rome's position and credibility. The Republic faced a choice between adaptation and collapse. For generations, plebeians had lived under the pressure of debt, law, and authority. Now that pressure flowed upward. The elite experienced what it meant to depend on those without power. This inversion was temporary, but unforgettable. The standstill could not continue indefinitely. Rome could not endure prolonged paralysis. Something had to change. The question was not whether the plebeians would return. It was what the Republic would offer in exchange. For the first time since the expulsion of the kings, Rome was forced to negotiate with its own people. And negotiation meant concession. The First Secession of the Plebs forced the Roman Republic into a position it had never anticipated and never planned for. For the first time since the expulsion of the kings, the state was compelled to negotiate not with an external enemy, but with its own citizens, citizens who had discovered that their absence was more powerful than their obedience. This negotiation did not arise from generosity, it arose from fear. The Senate understood the danger with clarity. Rome could not remain paralyzed. Its enemies would not wait. Its economy could not recover without labor. Its legitimacy could not survive prolonged abandonment. Yet the usual tools of authority were useless. There was no king to command obedience, no standing army to enforce order, no legal mechanism to compel participation without destroying the very idea of citizenship. The Republic had been designed to restrain power, and now it restrained itself. Violence was debated, but quickly dismissed. Any attempt to coerce the plebeians back would require soldiers drawn from the same class that had withdrawn. Even if force succeeded, the cost would be catastrophic. A republic built on the blood of its citizens would not endure. More importantly, repression would not solve the problem. It would deepen it. Fear could compel return but not loyalty, and Rome depended on loyalty far more than obedience. Negotiation was not an admission of equality. It was an admission of dependence. By sending envoys to the plebeians, the Senate acknowledged a truth it had long avoided. Rome could not function without them. This acknowledgement marked a subtle but profound shift in political reality. The plebeians were no longer petitioners. They were counterparts. Ancient sources describe respected figures, often older statesmen with reputations for moderation, acting as intermediaries. Their task was delicate. They had to persuade the plebeians to return without appearing to surrender elite authority. This required language that balanced concession with continuity. Promises were framed as restorations of harmony, not victories for one side. Reform was presented as correction, not transformation. Rome could adapt without admitting fault. The plebeians did not arrive at negotiation with an ideological manifesto. Their demands were practical, shaped by experience rather than theory. They wanted protection against arbitrary power, relief from debt abuse, a voice that could intervene when magistrates overreached. Above all, they wanted a guarantee that their suffering would no longer be invisible. They were not seeking to rule Rome. They were seeking to survive within it. For the ruling class, concession carried risk. Creating new institutions could weaken tradition. Granting formal protection might embolden future resistance. But refusal carried greater danger. The elite calculated that limited reform was preferable to systemic collapse. Better to concede one office than to lose the republic itself. This was pragmatism, not principle. The solution that emerged was characteristically Roman, additive rather than destructive. Instead of dismantling existing institutions, the republic would layer a new one alongside them. Authority would not be redistributed, it would be supplemented. This approach preserved continuity while addressing crisis. The republic would bend, not break. What made this negotiation historic was not simply its outcome, but its method. The plebeians had forced reform not through violence, but through withdrawal. Not through seizure of power, but through exposure of dependence. This set a precedent that could not be erased. The Republic learned that legitimacy required more than tradition. It required participation. When agreement was reached, it was framed as reconciliation. The language emphasized unity, shared identity, and the restoration of harmony. But beneath the rhetoric lay a transformation. Rome had acknowledged, however reluctantly, that authority without protection was unsustainable. The plebeians agreed to return. The city would live again, markets would reopen, armies would reform. But the republic they returned to was no longer the same. A new institution had been promised, one that would stand between magistrate and citizen. In granting it, Rome admitted something fundamental. That power once exposed cannot be unseen. The agreement that ended the First Secession of the Plebs did not abolish debt, erase inequality, or open the highest offices of the Republic to all citizens. Instead, it created something unprecedented in Roman political life, an office designed not to govern but to protect. This office was the Tribune of the Plebs. Its creation marked one of the most subtle yet consequential innovations in Roman history, an institution born not from theory, but from crisis. The tribunate did not resemble existing magistracies. Tribunes held no imperium. They commanded no armies. They did not preside over courts in the traditional sense. They did not represent the state. They represented the plebeians. This distinction mattered. Every other Roman magistrate derived authority from the Republic as a whole. The tribunes derived authority from a specific group, citizens who had withdrawn their participation and forced recognition. In effect, the Republic acknowledged a dual political reality within itself. Tribunes were chosen by the plebeians alone, in assemblies separate from those dominated by patricians. This ensured that their legitimacy did not depend on elite approval. For the first time, plebeians elected officials whose duty was explicitly to defend them. This did not make the tribunes sovereign. It made them accountable to the people who needed them most. The tribune's purpose was defensive. He existed to intervene when magistrates abused authority, when creditors overreached, when law threatened to crush the vulnerable. This focus on intervention, rather than governance, was deliberate. Rome did not yet accept the idea of plebeians ruling. It accepted the necessity of restraining excess. The tribunate was a shield, not a sword. Tribunes occupied a unique position. They were not part of the traditional cursus honorum. They did not advance through the ranks of elite office holding. They stood beside the system, close enough to affect it, distant enough to resist it. This ambiguity was its strength. Because tribunes were not magistrates in the conventional sense, they could challenge magistrates without undermining the Republic's core architecture. A tribune's authority depended on physical presence. He had to be accessible, visible, and responsive. His house was traditionally open. His body became a political instrument. If a magistrate attempted to arrest a plebeian unjustly, the tribune could physically intervene. This was not symbolic, it was immediate. Protection became tangible. Tribunes were expected to act. Inaction was failure. Their legitimacy rested on responsiveness, not status. This created a new dynamic in Roman politics, officials who gained authority through service rather than ancestry. For the plebeians, this mattered deeply. It transformed politics from distant ritual into lived experience. Patricians accepted the tribunate reluctantly. They recognized its necessity but feared its implications. An official empowered to obstruct magistrates threatened the smooth operation of authority. Yet this threat was precisely the point. Unchecked power had produced crisis. Limited obstruction promised stability. The tribunate embodied Rome's characteristic approach to reform. Instead of overturning the system, it absorbed pressure by creating space for opposition within it. Conflict was not eliminated. It was managed. The creation of the tribunate did not feel revolutionary at the time. It preserved appearances. Magistrates remained in office. The Senate retained influence. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, the Republic acknowledged that citizenship required protection, not just obligation. The plebeians returned to the city not as equals, but as recognized participants. Rome had learned to bend. The tribune of the plebs was not protected by armies, wealth, or lineage. His authority rested on something far more Roman, the sacred. To ensure that this new office could function in a society still dominated by elites, Rome wrapped it in religion, belief, and collective obligation. From this fusion emerged two of the most distinctive features of the tribunate, sacrosanctitas and the power of veto. Together, they transformed vulnerability into leverage. In early Rome, religion was not separate from politics. Law, ritual, and authority were interwoven. An act that violated sacred norms was not merely illegal, it was dangerous, offensive to the gods, and threatening to the community. The Republic understood this deeply. If the tribune was to stand against magistrates, he could not rely on legal hierarchy alone. He required protection that transcended law, something that even consuls would hesitate to violate. The solution was religious inviolability. The tribune was declared sacrosanct. To harm him was to commit sacrilege. Violence against his body was not simply a crime, It was an offense against the gods, punishable by death. This protection did not come from the Senate or the consuls. It came from a collective oath sworn by the plebeians themselves. In effect, the people sanctified their defender. This was a radical inversion of Roman norms. Sacred authority traditionally flowed downward from the elite. Here, it flowed upward from the people. Because a tribune's authority depended on physical presence, his body became a moving boundary. Where he stood, certain actions became impossible. If a magistrate attempted to arrest a citizen unjustly, the tribune could interpose himself. To push past him was to violate the sacred. To strike him was to invite divine wrath. Protection was no longer abstract, it was embodied. What made Sacrosanctitas effective was belief. Rome did not require a police force to enforce it. Social consensus did the work. Magistrates hesitated not because they feared punishment alone, but because they feared pollution, the spiritual and social consequences of sacrilege. Religion enforced restraint where law could not. Alongside sacred protection came another innovation, the right to veto, intercessio. Unlike traditional authority, the veto did not command action, it stopped it. A tribune could block legislation, halt arrests, and prevent enforcement of decisions deemed harmful to the plebs. This power was reactive rather than proactive, but its impact was immense. To say no, in a system built on command, was revolutionary. The veto did not challenge the republic's hierarchy directly. It did not allow tribunes to issue orders, lead armies, or govern territory. Instead, it introduced friction. Rome accepted this because friction preserved stability. A system that could pause, reconsider, and adjust was less likely to break. The veto was a safety valve. The veto was not universal. It worked only within the city. It required the tribune's presence. It could be countered by other tribunes. These limits reassured elites that the tribunate would not spiral into domination. Constraint made the innovation tolerable. With the tribunate, Roman politics gained a new grammar. Authority no longer flowed in a single direction. Power could be resisted without rebellion. Conflict became procedural. This was a profound shift. It allowed grievances to be addressed without threatening the republic's survival. Elite discomfort remained. Tribunes could be obstructive. They could slow governance. They could embarrass magistrates publicly. But this discomfort was preferable to collapse. Rome learned to govern, with resistance built in. The tribune's sacred protection represented an implicit contract. The plebeians would return to the city, resume service, and uphold the republic, so long as their defender remained inviolable. If the tribune fell, the contract broke. This gave plebeians a reason to believe in the system again. The power of veto did not solve inequality. It did not erase debt. It did not equalize opportunity. But it changed the dynamics of power. For the first time, a Roman citizen could expect intervention rather than mercy. The Republic had learned that authority must be restrained, not just divided. And in doing so, it had accepted a permanent tension at the heart of its politics. The creation of the Tribune of the Plebs marked a turning point in Roman political life, but it did not mark an endpoint. The reforms born from the First Secession were narrow by design, cautious in scope, and fragile in practice. They addressed the most dangerous symptoms of inequality without confronting its deeper causes. Rome had chosen stability over transformation. The tribunate was never intended to overturn the social order. It existed to prevent abuse, not to redistribute power. Its authority was reactive, dependent on intervention rather than initiative. This limitation was deliberate. By constraining the tribune's role, the elite ensured that reform would soothe unrest without threatening hierarchy. The Republic absorbed pressure while preserving structure. The tribune's power was confined largely to the city of Rome. Outside its sacred boundaries, his authority faded. Military command, foreign policy, and provincial administration remained untouched. This preserved elite control over the republic's expansion. Even within the city, the tribune's effectiveness depended on presence. Absence meant vulnerability. Distance meant impotence. Protection was powerful but localized. Tribunes did not act alone. Multiple tribunes were elected, each capable of vetoing the others. This prevented concentration of power, but it also diluted effectiveness. Unity was not guaranteed. Division among tribunes could neutralize reform. Elite influence could exploit these fractures. The office was strong, but not invincible. Patricians adapted quickly. They learned to delay actions, exploit religious technicalities, and maneuver around tribunes rather than confront them directly. Authority shifted, but it did not vanish. This adaptability preserved elite dominance while acknowledging limits. For plebeians, the tribunate raised expectations. Protection had been promised. Intervention was now possible. But when tribunes failed, whether through inaction, obstruction, or compromise, disappointment followed. The gap between promise and reality remained. Debt persisted. Land inequality continued. Political offices remained closed. The tribunate softened the sharpest edges of injustice, but it did not dismantle the system that produced it. Conflict was institutionalized, not resolved. The republic now rested on a delicate equilibrium. Too much obstruction could paralyze governance. Too little would reignite unrest. This balance required constant negotiation. Stability was no longer automatic. Despite its fragility, the reform endured because it worked well enough. It reduced the likelihood of collapse. It offered a channel for grievance. Rome learned to live with tension. The tribunate established a precedent. Political power could be expanded through pressure without revolution. Future generations would build upon this foundation, slowly, unevenly, and often violently. The First Secession did not solve Rome's problems. It taught Rome how to survive them. When the plebeians returned to the city, Rome resumed its rhythms with striking speed. Markets reopened. Fields were tended again. Armies reformed and marched. On the surface, the crisis appeared over. But beneath that surface, the Republic had been altered in ways that could not be reversed. The end of the First Secession was not a moment of unity. There was no shared celebration, no reconciliation of visions. The plebeians returned because they had secured protection, not because inequality had ended. The patricians accepted this return not as a moral reckoning, but as a practical necessity. The conflict had been paused, not healed. The existence of the tribunate permanently changed how power functioned in Rome. Magistrates could no longer act with impunity. Decisions now had to account for potential intervention. Authority became conditional. This did not weaken the Republic, it reshaped it. Before 494 BCE, social conflict was treated as a temporary disruption. After the secession, it became a recognized element of governance. Disagreement was no longer a threat to be suppressed. It was a force to be managed. This acceptance was one of Rome's greatest strengths. Rome learned that stability did not require harmony. It required balance. The Republic did not seek to eliminate inequality. It sought to prevent inequality from becoming catastrophic. This approach was pragmatic, not idealistic. The Republic's willingness to adapt, without surrendering its core identity, allowed it to survive challenges that destroyed other city-states. It bent where others broke. This resilience came at a cost. Inequality persisted. Reform was slow. Suffering continued. Rome survived, but many Romans paid the price. Later generations remembered the First Secession as a foundational moment. not because it created equality, but because it created process. It taught Rome how to negotiate with itself. The First Secession of the Plebs does not stand out in Roman history because it ended inequality, nor because it created harmony. It stands out because it revealed something essential about how Rome worked and how it would continue to survive for centuries. In 494 BCE, the Roman Republic did not become just. It became adaptable. Before the secession, power in Rome flowed in one direction. Authority issued commands, citizens obeyed. Participation was assumed, not negotiated. The plebeians were expected to endure because endurance had always been demanded of them. The secession shattered that assumption. For the first time, Rome was forced to recognize that power did not rest solely in offices, laws, or tradition. It rested in participation. When participation was withdrawn, authority emptied itself. This realization never fully faded. What makes the First Secession remarkable is its restraint. The plebeians did not burn the city. They did not assassinate leaders. They did not attempt to replace the Republic with something new. They did something far more Roman. They forced the system to acknowledge its dependence, and then allowed it to continue. This was not revolution. It was negotiation through absence. Rome's response to crisis followed a pattern that would repeat again and again. Faced with internal pressure, the Republic did not dismantle itself. It added layers. New offices, new rules, new compromises. Each reform preserved the old order while subtly changing how it functioned. This incrementalism frustrated idealists, but it preserved continuity. Rome survived not because it was fair, but because it was flexible. After 494 BCE, social conflict was no longer an aberration. It was built into the system. The tribunate institutionalized opposition. Resistance became procedural rather than destructive. This was a profound innovation. The Republic accepted that tension was not a failure of governance, but a condition of it. The secession did not resolve debt. It did not grant land. It did not open the highest offices to the plebs. Those battles would take generations, and many would never be fully won. But the precedent endured. When plebeians later demanded written law, access to magistracies, or protection against exploitation, they could point backward to a moment when withdrawal forced recognition. History remembered that pressure worked. The legacy of 494 BCE is not entirely positive. By choosing containment over transformation, Rome allowed inequality to persist beneath a veneer of order. The Republic learned how to delay reckoning. This delay bought stability, but also stored tension. Centuries later, those tensions would reemerge in more dangerous forms. And yet, without this moment, the Republic might not have survived at all. Many ancient states collapsed when confronted with internal division. Rome endured because it learned when to yield without surrendering itself. The First Secession taught Rome a crucial lesson: that authority must be defended, not just enforced. Later Romans would look back on 494 BCE as the beginning of a long struggle between orders, not a single conflict, but a continuous negotiation over power, protection, and belonging. The Republic did not promise equality. It promised endurance. And endurance required listening, eventually, to those without power. The First Secession of the Plebs reminds us that some of history's most lasting changes begin not with conquest, but with refusal, not with violence, but with absence, not with the seizure of power, but with the exposure of dependence. Rome did not fall in 494 BCE. It learned how close it could come and how to step back. That lesson would shape the Republic for centuries to come. If you'd like to keep exploring history's biggest questions, you're welcome to subscribe and continue this journey. And if there's a moment from the past you think deserves a deeper look, feel free to share it in the comments.